So yeah, thank you very much for coming and sharing your Sunday morning with us here at Africa Utopia. We have got a selection of newspapers and a selection of panellists, and we're going to combine the two for a lovely Sunday morning read of the newspaper. I do quite a lot of kind of reviewing of newspapers and stuff on various radio networks, and I'm always surprised by how rarely stories focusing on Africa are featured. So this is going to be a full-on Africa-focused session. So joining me today on the panel, we have, at the far end, we have Mmabatho Selemela, founder of Africa Reads. Next to Mimi, we have Ibrahim Muhanna, founder of IE Muhanna & Co, actuary. And then next to me, immediately, we have Dr Ola Orekunrin, founder of Flying Doctors Nigeria. Before we start, I'm just going to ask the panellists to say a couple of words about themselves, just to put themselves in context before we dive into the newspapers. So Mimi, if you could just say a little bit about Africa Reads.
Thanks, Hannah. Africa Reads is based in South Africa, which is where I'm from. It's basically a space that celebrates reading. As you know, popular narrative, every time you speak to someone about books or reading, they always say, oh, people aren't reading, nothing's happening. But there is an army of readers in Africa, around the world, and I thought that we needed a space for avid readers to come together and celebrate this ancient art of reading.
Great, thank you very much. And Ibrahim, tell us a bit about your work.
I'm an actuary, as Hannah just mentioned. I don't know if anybody of you know what an actuary is. We try to put a price to the future. So we are specialized in pricing risk. And my company operates in the Middle East and in Africa. And through my work, I realized that this profession is underdeveloped in Africa. So I created the Muhanna Foundation, which is a sister company to Muhanna & Co, and start developing capacity in Africa. We give scholarships, we give awards, and we do a lot of training. And recently, we started training politicians because the policymakers, unfortunately, are unaware of the implication of their decisions, primarily in social security reform and national health care.
Great, thank you very much. And Ola.
I'm a medical physician and an entrepreneur, and I started the first indigenous air ambulance service in West Africa. So our job is to fly hundreds of people per year from areas where they've overwhelmed the level of care to a more suitable level of care for them. I'm also very passionate about women, especially women in the context of healthcare and entrepreneurship on the continent. So I'm looking forward to talking a bit about that.
Fabulous, thank you very much. So Mimi, I'm going to start with you. What's your first story and which newspaper is it from? I'm going to try and, we have a screen up here, so I'm going to try and match the two so the audience can also see. So what do you have? You've got the Daily Mail. Hang on a second.
Yeah, I've got the Mail.
What page do you have?
32. It's the Oscar Pistorius story. Yes. Well, I can't seem to escape the story. Everywhere I go around the world, as soon as people find out that I'm from South Africa, all they want to know is what's happening with the Oscar Pistorius trial. But this story is interesting because it's from Riva Steenkamp's brother talking about how he feels that Oscar got away with murder, which is obviously how a lot of people in South Africa feel. Mm-hmm. He was obviously acquitted of murder and he's guilty of culpable homicide, which is manslaughter. So,
when did you leave South Africa for this trip? Was it before?
2 days ago. It was,
right.
It was just the day that he was acquitted of murder, and the next day I was arriving here and he was found guilty of culpable homicide.
And so what was the mood among your circle of friends in terms of the verdict?
I mean, the country is a bit divided. There are those people who support Oscar and there are those who feel an injustice has been done. And so, yeah, you either fall. Yeah, but those who people feel that he got away with murder.
And how about in terms of the representation of the story in the media? So it's interesting for me. I mean, you happen to have picked up on the Daily Mail.
Yeah.
I don't know how much you know about the Daily Mail in terms of its history
Yes,
here.
tabloid.
Okay, right. So for those who may not know, the Daily Mail is known for its right-wing approach,
Yes.
and not known for being particularly good on matters of race or gender. And so, how do you feel this story was portrayed in this particular paper?
Well, I mean, it is a bit, because it's the brother, it's obviously personal, but there's a little bit of sensationalism and, what can you say? It's supposed to be about what he says, how he feels. So, yeah, you can't really do much with it.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. Ibrahim, your first story.
Actually, my first,
If you
not
could just let me
story.
know where it's from, so I can just get it up on the screen.
You can have it.
Okay. You do.
That's okay. Save you. You can tell I'm at a disadvantage being with 3 women and 3 black women. So, actually, when I was asked to review, I flipped through the newspapers this morning, and I told Hannah that now I value my secretary even more because she does all the paper clippings for me. Because now I realize how important to go through all these papers. And since I have an economical mind, I was looking primarily for subjects that are covering some kind of economy in Africa, which I found none, which is quite interesting. But I'd like to share with you that in Africa, you barely find also specialized journalism. So even newspapers in Africa does not cover very much the subject that I was looking for in the UK. I did find a subject is very important now is being talked about. As you know, there's voting coming up this Thursday about Scotland becoming independent. And all of a sudden, the economic journalism in the UK is covering the implication of that decision on the pension funds of different occupations, such as the Bank in Scotland, Lloyd's, and many BP and so many other big employers. Whereas when we had major reform in Nigeria, the Social Security was very major reform took place, and the media didn't really prepare people to what the implication of this reform is. So my take this morning is really the lack of media coverage on the economy of Africa from within Africa and of course from outside Africa.
And what do you think can be done to change that?
I think it will change because right now people are becoming eager to do business in Africa. Yesterday I was in a panel in Africa gathering talking about data. The lack of data, lack of information in Africa is the one that is keeping people in the dark. And it's very interesting. My colleague was talking about taking people, flying people in for healthcare, but saying hundreds. But is that hundreds a lot? Out of how many potential need? Is the need millions, or the needs 10,000, or the need, is she capturing all the need of Africa? We don't really know. So the lack of information in Africa is very, very important. And unfortunately, many policy makers in Africa think keeping people in the dark is better for them because they can rule them better. So information has to start building up, and I don't know if any of the people here are NGOs working in Africa. I hold NGOs responsible also because they go and get information and keep the information to themselves. They don't publish information and they don't share information. There's a lot of duplication of work and there's a lack of cumulative information.
Mm-hmm. And even that itself is not reported, is it? There's a closed shop within the NGOs. We all know that they're keeping information. We all know that they're duplicating work, but no one's really talking about it in the press.
Yeah, I'd like to come in here. I mean, over the past few years, media coverage on Africa has changed radically, from the doom and gloom, poverty, war, and now it's the euphoria, it's Africa's rise and whatever. I mean, in Southern Africa as a whole, there is a lot of information available on everything, you know. And another thing is that, you know, Africa is not a country. We have like 54 countries, and those of us who live there know that what happens in Eritrea is very different from what happens in Johannesburg, what happens in Morocco, in Lagos. And so the answer is neither the euphoria nor the, you know, the doom and gloom. It's really about, you know, being nuanced and dealing with each country individually and the problems of those countries. And a lot of the times when you read about Africa from outside, you know, it's always just this grouped together, well, Ebola, you know, some American actress was saying, oh, I was supposed to travel to Africa, but I'm not going because of Ebola. I mean, Ebola is in like 5 countries in West Africa and the rest of the continent, you know. So I think that we have to be careful about how we actually write on Africa and speak about Africa. And there are a lot of outlets, especially online, Africa as a country, in South Africa as a whole, there's a lot of media freedom and people get to write on everything. So information is available. It's there, it's out there. You just have to, you know, read and be open.
Great. Which brings us to
just on the subject of the way Africa is covered in the media, I think there has been a good sort of Africa rising narrative, but I also think that the overriding reporting on Africa is still this disaster pornography, isn't it? It's this, you know, AIDS and, you know, everybody is poor and Africa needs help. And I think that as long as that overriding idea continues to exist, then the world will not see Africa or Africans as equals. And I think that this is what causes a problem. I think that Africa is underrepresented on nearly all of the sort of world governing bodies that make decisions, so the IMF, the UN, the World Bank, and therefore I don't think Africa even gets a fair negotiating right. I think that if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu, and I don't think Africans' views are fairly represented, or Africans are fairly represented on these worldwide bodies. So, for example, the Chinese, Russians, Indians, and Chinese just got together to form the BRICS Bank, which will be sort of an infrastructure development bank for the developing world. And why did they do this? They did this because they felt, as a lot of African countries feel, that we weren't really getting a fair deal from the existing world organizations that give loans. They give loans with a lot of strings attached, with high rates, with a lot of due diligence, and I don't think that Africans or most of the developing world felt like we were getting a fair enough deal from these organizations to really enhance our own development. And I think that it was also quite prescriptive. So the money was there, but the development had to happen in a certain way, and it had to sort of mirror what was happening in the West. And I think the BRICS Bank now offers a good opportunity for us to be able to develop on our own terms. But I also think that the media coverage has a huge role to play in making sure that we're telling the good stories as well as the bad stories, and making sure that we highlight opportunities for investment, opportunities for business, because we're not going to develop from aid. Aid has never developed any country. We're going to develop from fair trade. It's a bit of an irony, I think, that Africa has the most natural resources in the world, but still remains the poorest continent. So that means that there's some form of disconnect between what is being produced and how it's being sold. Yeah. So I think it's important, the media has a huge role to play in sort of reforming Africa's image so that we're seen as equals.
Mm-hmm. And so in terms of one of the most recent stories, obviously, which very much in terms of the way that's been covered in terms of that kind of disaster porn triangle of war, poverty, famine, disease, is obviously the way the Ebola story has been covered. Have you been aware of how it's being covered outside of the continent?
Absolutely, yes.
And how has that played into everything you've just spoken about?
We've had 17 cases of Ebola in Nigeria, and nearly over half of them, in fact, have survived. And the way it's been covered in the media has seen international companies pulling out of Nigeria completely. We've seen mass sort of repatriations of staff, which has had a huge effect on the Nigerian economy. I run a business in Nigeria, and we were supposed to have some investors come in. Now, there are no cases of Ebola as at today in Nigeria at all, but because of the coverage that it's had, they've refused to come into Nigeria because of Ebola. And I kind of said that there were no cases of Ebola in Nigeria at all right now, but the coverage has been that this disease is afflicting the whole of Africa, and Africa is now a danger zone, and if you go into Africa, then you're going to catch Ebola and die. And that's not the case at all. I mean, I don't mean to understate what's happening in Liberia and in Guinea and in Sierra Leone, where the resources are really, really stretched, and they're really, really having a difficult time managing this disease, as they would have anywhere. But I think that the media has cast it as this horrible affliction that's afflicting the entire continent, and it's had huge economic and social repercussions for us.
It's almost as if they've been holding all that tension in whilst everyone's been writing all these Africa Rising stories, and suddenly they're like, oh my God, great, let's just go crazy, let's just write how we wrote 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Mimi?
Yeah, I think another thing that we do at Africa Reads and a lot of other organizations in South Africa and around the continent is that we stopped looking to the West, to read about Africa. We are writing stories on Africa from Africa. And I mean, there was a time where South African newspapers were reporting South African stories from an angle of foreign correspondents. They would take stories from outside and just copy and paste. And because of social media and the internet, people started writing about Africa from an African perspective. And so those stories were overtaking the stories of the actual journalists. And that's been amazing to watch. And I think that Africa's problems are not going to be solved outside of Africa. I think that the more we look to ourselves and the more we come up with solutions for ourselves, that's really where the answer lies. So that's been a very positive change in my view.
And I think that Ebola will really add to this sort of thinking that Africa really needs to stand up and solve its own problems. I mean, Ebola was discovered, we knew about Ebola, we've known about Ebola since the 1970s, and we're still looking to America to provide ZMAP for us. Ebola has never happened in America before. They've never had an outbreak in America before. I think that it was up to us. From the 80s, we should have gotten together and formed a lab and looked into this disease ourselves, because we can't expect America to do that. It doesn't affect them. That's why there's been no research. And that's why we have no solution, no cure. I think now this Ebola outbreak has been a huge wake-up call for Africans, that we can't start waiting for a cure for Japan. We can't start waiting for a cure from England or America. If we have a problem, then we need to get together and solve it ourselves. Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, we should have gotten together time ago. Exactly, we should have gotten our best scientists together,
absolutely,
formed a lab somewhere and solved this problem years ago. It is up to us. This is not an international problem, it's actually an African problem. And I think that it highlights what you just said about Africa. We actually need to solve our own problems, because nobody is going to come and solve them for us.
Let me add to something that Mimi just mentioned. It reminded me with a book called The Orientalist that was written by Edward Said, talking about the West coming to the East, reading about the East, writing about the East, drawing the East, and then coming to the West, telling about what is the East all about. And what happened later on, the West was going back to the East, telling the East about themselves. And this is what's happening about Africa. You hear about Africa from the people from outside Africa. It's about time to really let the outside world know what Africa needs and try to really work it from the inside.
Mimi, your next story, please.
I'm picking up all the tabloid newspapers.
I know, it's fine.
It's from The Sun.
I mean, it's what most people read, so...
And I think this has been mostly covered in the UK. I didn't read about this at all in South Africa until I arrived in London, which is very interesting.
You just read the headline?
Yeah, Eritrean immigrants who target Britain. Obviously, this is from a British point of view about the strain that these immigrants or Eritrean immigrants are putting on the British system. And so obviously it's covered from that angle.
Yeah, so this is a story that's particularly close to my heart, although I just hasten to say the sun is not particularly close to my heart in any way. This story was actually covered in the Observer last week. Mark Townsend did a really beautifully written and heartbreaking story about the journey he was following. It was the journey of one Eritrean who, through the most arduous means, found his way to the UK. I'm Eritrean, proud Eritrean, and these stories. I mean, I've read the headlines of this one and a bit of it, and the tone is very different to the tone that was in the Observer piece. And this story both kind of breaks my heart and makes me incredibly angry for lots of reasons. And I think it's really interesting to see the UK tabloids pick it up. It's not new. This has been happening. Anybody within, not just the Eritrean community, but lots of communities know about these stories and the awful journeys. Members of my family, friends have made these journeys, and they are awful, and they are awful for a reason, and people are leaving for reasons, and it's utterly heartbreaking. What's interesting is, as you said, this is not something that you have. It's not a story. It's almost a local story.
Yes.
It's an international story. It's becoming a local story. Do you think that's? I mean, having read it, what's your perspective? Having read it from the Sun.
Well, it just reminded me of the doom and gloom African stories that I've been so removed from for a long time. You know, it just took me back there. But I mean, it is heartbreaking to read something like this about actual human beings and people. And it's just like, you know, it's not the kind of story you want to read about, but these things are happening, as you're saying, and it's very heartbreaking. And I just prefer it to come from a human angle instead of just, you know, these refugees.
Sensationalism. It reminds me of, we were doing an air ambulance journey. We were flying somebody to Paris, and the patient deteriorated, so we actually had to land at a field hospital in the middle of the Sahara Desert. So I get to the hospital, we admit the patient, and just as I was going outside, remember this is in the middle of the Sahara at like 1 a.m. in the morning, I run into a Nigerian guy. I'm like, so whereabouts are you from? He said he's Nigerian. I'm like, so how did you get here? He said he had walked across the Sahara. I'm like, but why did you walk across the Sahara? He said he lived in Lagos and he was a market man and his shop burnt down. I'm like, so you lived in Lagos, your shop burnt down, and you decided with the little money you had, you were going to use it to walk across the Sahara, get to Algeria, get a boat, across the ocean to Spain and try and start a new life there. Now you're in the Sahara Desert. I said, so how many people made the journey with you? He said 200. I said, so how many people got here? He said 3. And I thought that Lagos is like one of, if you want to be economically successful in life, then live in Lagos.
Yes.
Even if you're selling, this is a city of over 40 million people. Even if you're selling toothpaste, you should be a billionaire in Lagos.
Yes.
And this guy decided, rather than starting a new business in Lagos, he was trying to get to Europe. So I asked him, what do you think you're going to do in Europe? He said he'll get a job. I said, how? He said, oh, you know, people have gotten there before and he's going to get a job, he's going to be rich in Europe. And I thought that this must be a common story. This must be a common line of thought for so many Africans. They think that they're going to get to Europe and going to be rich. Aliko Dangote is the richest man in Africa, and he made his money without even leaving Nigeria. And he's the richest black man alive. He's richer than Jay-Z, he's richer than Beyonce, he's richer than Oprah, he's richer than all the black superstars that we see. And he made all of that money in Nigeria, not even leaving Nigeria at all. So people have this false impression somehow that leaving Africa will lead to some sort of wealth, and it's just not true. And I felt so bad, like meeting this man who said that he had run out of water half of the way, that he had to drink like people's urine just to get through the journey. And it's all based on a false perception that when they get there, something amazing is going to happen, which it isn't.
And of course, there is that story, and there are also obviously people who are leaving, who are fleeing human rights, persecution,
Yes.
and those both the journeys and those shattered dreams are of a different nature often.
Absolutely. I just think it's so sad that there's this idea amongst so many Nigerians, especially, that they can they can flee into, and it's going to be a better situation. And sometimes it's just not. So I actually left that man in the Sahara. We got on our plane and went back. But I think about him often, and I think about how many hundreds of thousands of Nigerians are leaving every year in hope of something that just doesn't really exist.
And I think about I'm incredibly aware of the thousands of Eritreans leaving Eritrea, ending up in camps in the desert, ending up kidnapped, ending up in these awful boats. And what I find so heartbreaking when these stories are recovered, and please, I really do urge you, if you don't read it in The Sun, go and read The Observer's version of this story, which is by Mark Townsend last weekend. You'll be able to look it up if you look at his name. And it just gives you, it's not a perfect story, but it gives you a bit of an insight into these journeys. It really is something worth reading. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, no,
I was
Mimi,
going
comment.
to come in here. Talking about moving for economic, reasons. What's been interesting in countries like Mozambique and Angola is that a lot of the Portuguese and Spanish people are returning to Angola. Angola is like one of the most thriving countries on the African continent right now. And so it's been interesting to see the reverse of
And I would love to know whether Angolan
but
papers
those
are
stories
saying
not
like,
covered.
Portuguese immigrants flooding
Yes,
Angola.
Yes. So, yeah.
Ibrahim, you had another story.
Actually,
You need to let me know which paper it's from, and then I can.
you can have it if you
okay.
like, or it is. It's the Independent, page 35. Actually, this is a story that Hannah chose because she thought it's Egypt and I'm Lebanese. Maybe we connect. Although I don't think of Egypt being African, although it's an African continent. But it's sad, we live that on a daily basis in the Arab world, talking about what happened in the Arab Spring. And as a consequence of the Arab Spring is what's happening in Egypt with all the activists, and in particular women who are not veiled, that are being harassed for any activity. And it's interesting that they talk about this young lady, Salam, that she was not even in the protest. She was not even protesting, but she was arrested because she was walking by. And this, although we think that of the Arab Spring is liberating Egypt and we have freedom, there is less freedom now in Egypt than before, although I'm not advocating the regime of before, but unfortunately, the Arab Spring, there's nothing spring about it in the Arab world. We haven't seen nothing but destruction, and we don't know where we're going. So Amnesty International is lobbying a lot, and we know very well how many journalists have been condemned and been jailed and been harassed in Egypt since the change of government in Egypt, and several times, the 3 times that the government have changed. So this is a story that did reach the media, but I think through the Amnesty International point of view, not more than really sympathetic to the Egyptian, what's happening in Egypt.
So where do you go then? If these stories aren't reaching the traditional or mainstream media, where do you go to find them, Ibrahim?
Online.
I believe online, you're right, and as was mentioned earlier, the local have to start covering these issues more and more. But internationally speaking, don't expect the world to really help Egypt the way we don't expect the world to solve solution to Ebola. This is something Egyptian problem should be solved within Egypt.
And you said at the beginning that you don't consider Egypt to be... I can't let you get away with that.
Unfortunately, all North Africa, we never thought about it as Africa. I mean, when we say we are going to Algeria or Tunisia or Morocco, we say them by names. On the other hand, when we visit any other country, we say we are going to Africa. Although this is not correct, I like to stand corrected. For the past 7-8 years that I've been frequenting Africa, I find a big difference between Rwanda or Gambia or Tanzania and Burundi or Kenya, and each one has its own joys, its own problems, and its own challenges. And I make a point, my company, we operate in 38 countries. Only the African countries, I make a point that don't send any of my staff without me going, because I enjoy going. The other countries like Dubai or Qatar, I tend not to go. I send other people to these places. But in Africa, I even have residents, so I spend a lot of time in Africa.
I can remember when we were actually in Harare, a few Nigerians over the weekend, and we're like, this feels so African. We feel like we're in Africa from Nigeria.
That's so
because
interesting.
it's so random to be in another African country. I mean, for us, like, we're really Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, maybe that's about it. So when we go into Africa, it's like, oh, we feel so African now. We're actually in a proper, like, it looks more African. They have animals and stuff, so it's different.
Okay, so
it's different from
images
Nigeria.
from the West. For me, being in West Africa actually feels more African because South Africa is just another country altogether.
Yeah.
And so when I travel to Nigeria or Ghana, I feel, or Senegal, I'm so excited because I feel like, oh my God, I'm in Africa.
And South Africa's relationship with the rest of the continent has been completely different because of its history.
It's been completely different.
And
It was
isolated.
removed from, we dealt with Southern Africa mostly because we had the same problems, but because of apartheid, we couldn't get information about other, countries, East Africa, West Africa, especially, and certain North Africa. A lot of South Africans who work on the continent, and random South Africans will say, oh, I'm traveling to Africa, and... Of course.
This whole notion of who does and doesn't consider themselves African within Africa. I remember walking down the street in Asmara with one of my brothers, and it was quite a long time ago. It was when the UN was still in Eritrea, and it was the Kenyan UN. And bearing in mind, Kenya was not very far. And one of my brothers kind of grabbed me and said, "Look at that black man." And I was like, We're in it. No, look at the African. And I was like, we're in Eritrea. And again, Eritreans often don't refer to themselves as African. And that, to me, is a reflection and a hangover from all kinds of colonialism and all kinds of the idea that North Africa is a kind of better version of Africa because it's nearer and it's lighter and feeds into all kinds of things to do with identity and politics and socioeconomics. And it's really interesting hearing that it's still very much... That's still very much is around.
It is around, but it is changing, certainly in South Africa, especially now because of, the economic opportunities that are happening on the continent, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria. And so people are kind of going through a mind shift, which is very difficult, especially for South Africans, because South Africa was seen as the country on the continent, and actually we are being overtaken because of this provincialism. But the rest of us who are aware and are dealing with everyone else from the continent, it's actually been amazing to find solutions from Africans and to deal with other Africans, especially in business. That's been really
Nigeria
amazing.
now is the largest economy in Africa.
Yes.
I don't know if any of you know that the Minister of Finance of Nigeria is supposed to be, in my opinion, the president of the World Bank. And unfortunately, she was not voted into that position because she's African, or she's not American, let's put it this way. And it's a loss to the world because I think she's a very, very capable person. And lucky to Nigeria that she's went back to become the Minister of Finance. But the World Bank is an American bank more than anything else. And we have major personalities in Africa. One of the biggest promising projects took place is in Kenya, whereby they are using mobile telecommunication for exchanging money hands between farmers, between payments, things that we don't think about outside. So they are finding local solutions in Africa, but the challenges are by far more. So it's a promising world.
I think we have, I know we have run a little bit over time, so so we're going to draw it to a close there, but just please say a huge thank you, and thank you also to yourselves for joining this Sunday newspaper review. Thanks very much to the panel.
Thank you.